The listing had been up for 6 hours before Dex Harlow found it, and in the Meridian Flats rental market, 6 hours was ancient history. Room available sublevel 7, Callowell Block, apartment 4C furnished. Single occupant preferred. Utilities split 3 ways. No noise after the 20-second bell. References welcome but not required. No photos. No price listed in the body, just a contact code and the words reasonable terms. In a market where a broom closet with a port window went for 1,400 Terran credits a month, reasonable terms was either a trap or a miracle, and Dex Harlow had been living out of the workers' dormitory on Sub-12 long enough that he was willing to risk either. The dormitory on Sub-12 had 48 bunks to a bay, shared ablution facilities that ran cold from the 15th bell onward, because too many people were using them at once, and a communal lounge that smelled permanently of something he had never been able to identify with confidence, but suspected was a combination of rehydrated protein packets and low-grade despair. He had been there for 11 months. His bunk assignment had changed 4 times due to rotation protocols that made theoretical sense and practical misery, and his current neighbor was a dock worker named Goss, who had nothing specifically wrong with him, except that he snored with a volume and consistency that suggested his airways, had made a private agreement to ruin Dex's sleep schedule, and had been honoring it without interruption for 6 weeks. He had saved enough in 11 months of courier work to afford something better. He had also spent 11 months finding that something better on Meridian Station's sublevel residential market meant, in practice, a choice between apartments that cost twice his monthly courier income and apartments that appeared in listings under descriptions like asterisk cozy, small, community-oriented asterisk no doors, or unique character. The wall was doing something structurally interesting, and not in a good way. The 4C listing was the first one in 11 months that had read like something a sane person had written. He pinged the code at 6:20 on a Thursday morning, fully expecting no response until midday. The reply came in 40 seconds. "Come at the 18th bell, don't be late, 4C. Dex looked at the message for a long moment. Then he looked at the 4 walls of his dormitory bunk. A shelf of pressboard bolted above him, a curtain rod that listed 3 degrees to the left, and a ventilation grate that smelled, inexplicably, of something between pickled brine and electrical solder, and he wrote back, "I'll be there." Callowell Block was not the worst residential tower in Meridian Station's sublevel district. That title went to the Gantry Arms on Sub-9, which had famously experienced a slow-motion structural argument with its eastern wall for the better part of a decade, and showed no signs of resolving it. Callowell was merely old. Its corridors were narrow and painted in a pale institutional green that had been fashionable about 40 years ago, and had been regretting itself ever since. Its lift worked on 4 days out of 5, and the stairwell smelled of someone else's cooking in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. Dex took the stairs, because the lift was having one of its off days. Apartment 4C sat at the end of the 4th-floor corridor, past a door sealed with biometric tape, and a wall panel someone had carefully decorated with a series of small mineral specimens arranged by color gradient. He noted the specimens, amber to violet, dust-pale rose in between, and wondered briefly whether that was a cultural thing, a personal thing, or just what happened when you had a good eye and enough wall space. He knocked. There was a pause of about 4 seconds, then the door opened. Dex had been on Meridian Station for 11 months. He had worked in the cargo distribution center on Sub-4, spent 2 months in the water reclamation auxiliary on Sub-10, and currently worked courier transit between the commercial levels and the residential sublevel ring. In 11 months he had met Vantari, Ashkarai, 3 species he couldn't name on sight, a Vel-Keth transit researcher who had once politely corrected his pronunciation of a planetary system, and then apologized for correcting him within the same breath, and a 7-foot Grenathi dock supervisor named Culith, who had taken an inexplicable liking to Dex's habit of eating lunch at the loading bay ledge and had begun, without comment, to share portions of his mid-shift meal. He thought he was reasonably calibrated for surprise. The woman in the doorway had skin the color of polished obsidian threaded with deep blue undertones, and it caught the corridor light in a way that suggested her biology was doing something more active than simply reflecting it. Her eyes were pale silver, not light gray, but a genuine, faint luminescent silver, like old mirrors turned slightly toward the window. She was nearly as tall as Dex, which put her taller than most of the human population he'd met on station, and her posture conveyed the specific quality of someone who was accustomed to being studied and found the practice mildly exhausting. Her hair was dark and gathered close to her head with a series of thin silver clasps. She was wearing a high-collared tunic the color of slate, and her expression said, clearly and without hostility, that she had opened this door as a courtesy, and she was reserving judgment on whether that had been the correct decision. "You're the one who replied," she said. Her Terran standard was precise and faintly formal, like someone who had learned it from written sources before spoken ones. "Dex Harlow, yes." He didn't offer his hand on Meridian with multi-species populations. You learned fast that handshakes were not universal and that offering one uninvited was the conversational equivalent of sneezing on someone. From the listing. She studied him for a moment. Then she stepped back and held the door open, which he took as an invitation and walked through. The apartment was better than he expected. There was a common room with a low table and 3 chairs arranged in a loose triangle, a kitchen alcove with actual counter space, and 2 closed doors on the far wall that he assumed were the existing occupied rooms, and 1 open door that showed him a modest space with a cot, a wall-mounted shelf, and a port window that currently showed the amber-lit inner ring of Sub-7's residential tier. The floor was a dark pressed polymer that had been kept clean. The air smelled faintly of something resinous and not unpleasant. Someone had arranged a collection of mineral specimens on the low table in the same gradient color pattern as the ones in the hall. "The room is 320 credits, the woman said, which was so far below the current market rate that Dex processed it with a slight delay, like a sentence in a language he hadn't expected to hear. "Utilities split 3 ways from that point. I keep the utilities account. You pay me your share on the first of each station cycle." He stopped. "That's very reasonable." The listing said reasonable terms. It did. He looked at her. "Can I ask why it's that price?" She considered the question. "Because I calculated the running cost per occupant at the 3-way split, and then set the room contribution to a figure that covers the actual cost plus a reasonable buffer for contingency. I didn't see any reason to charge more than that." Dex stood in the middle of the common room and looked at the mineral specimens on the table and thought about the dormitory bunk and the off-listing vent, and decided that whatever the catch was, he was going to find out about it after he signed the agreement. "I'll take it," he said. The woman, she had not yet given her name, looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. Not displeasure, something more like a careful reassessment. "You should meet the other tenant first," she said. One of the closed doors opened. The second woman was shorter than the first by a considerable margin, which still put her at roughly Dex's chin height, and where the first woman's coloring was cool and deep, the second was the color of pale copper verging on rose gold skin that caught light differently, more warmly, with a faint iridescence at the cheekbones, and the collarbones that suggested bioluminescence running just below the surface. Her eyes were a dark amber with vertical pupils, and her hair was a warm red-brown that she wore loose, which was the only thing loose about her. Her expression was precise and evaluating in the same way the first woman's was, but where the first woman conveyed measured reserve, this one conveyed something that felt more like sharpened curiosity held carefully in check. She looked at Dex. She looked at the first woman. She said something in a language Dex didn't recognize, clipped consonants, a rising inflection at the end, and the first woman replied in the same language with what sounded like a short, factual sentence. "He says he'll take it," the first woman explained in Terran Standard, which Dex realized she had offered as a translation for his benefit. "Without asking more questions," the second woman said. Her Terran Standard had a slightly different quality, more melodic, with a tendency to lengthen the middle syllables of longer words. She had switched to it easily and without comment, which suggested she was comfortable in it rather than performing competence. "He asked why the price was reasonable," the first woman said. The second woman looked at Dex with an expression he couldn't fully decode. "And I gave him an accurate answer," the first woman said. "He said he'd take it." The second woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said to Dex, "You should know that we are not sociable. We maintain our spaces and our schedules. We don't hold common meals. We don't expect conversation in the shared areas. The arrangement is functional, if you require a great deal of social." "I work courier transit," Dex said. "I'm out of the apartment by 600 and most nights I'm back by the 19th bell. I make my own food. I'm quiet after the 22nd bell. I'm not going to bother you." Another exchange in the language he couldn't place. This one was longer, with a back-and-forth quality, and the second woman's vertical pupils tracked to him and away twice during it. "My name is Sarath," the first woman said when they'd finished. "She is Kale. We'll prepare the co-tenancy agreement." He moved in on a 10-day and was wrong about almost everything he'd assumed. The first thing he was wrong about was the quiet. Sarath was quiet. Sarath moved through the apartment with a controlled economy that barely registered. He sometimes wasn't certain she was home until he caught the faint resinous scent from her room or noticed the light under her door. But Kale had a habit of working at the common table at odd hours, and her work involved a significant amount of things being set down at varying degrees of emphasis, the occasional low vocalization that wasn't quite speech, and the repeated opening and closing of small containers that clinked against each other in a way that was not loud but was insistently present. He discovered this at 200 on his third night, when he came out to get water and found her sitting cross-legged on the table, not at it, on it, with a spread of small instruments and data tablets arranged around her, and a pair of optical analysis tools propped on her nose, enlarging her amber eyes to an unsettling degree. She looked at him, he looked at her. "I have a project," she said, in a tone that suggested this explained everything. "Okay," Dex said and got his water. "You're not going to complain about the light." She was watching him. The optical tools made her expression difficult to read. "You're within the agreed noise windows. It's your right to use the common space." He paused. "Is that copper work?" He'd noticed the instruments, the kind of small-scale precision tools you'd use on conductive materials. She looked at the spread around her as if confirming it was still there. "It's a resonance lattice. I'm a materials engineer. Sublevel station environments create specific interference patterns that affect lattice stability, and I need to—" She stopped. "You asked about the copper. I used to do some metal work. The tools look familiar." Kale was quiet for a moment in a way that was different from Sarath's reserve, less a held-back assessment and more something that seemed like genuine recalibration. "The principles are similar," she said after a moment. "The copper isn't decorative. It's a conductor for the resonance test." "Can I see it?" He crossed to the table and looked without touching. The lattice was a small flat disk, about the width of his palm, with a geometric structure that caught the light from different facets as the station's ambient vibration moved through it. It was genuinely beautiful. "That's intricate." "I know," she said, and it wasn't boasting. It was the same register as the lattice statement, a factual observation about a thing she had made. She watched him look at it for a moment. The interference pattern on this level distorts the outer ring by 0.3 millimeters if I don't compensate before fixing. How do you compensate? She told him. It was a detailed answer, technically specific, delivered without any visible concern about whether he would follow it, and he did follow most of it, and the parts he didn't follow he asked about. They talked for 30 minutes about metallurgical resonance testing before either of them seemed to notice how long it had been. She had a way of explaining technical processes that was entirely without condescension. She seemed to calibrate in real time, watching his comprehension register, and then adding the next layer, and the sensation was less like being taught something and more like being led into a room that had always been there. He told her he used to do copperwork, small decorative pieces mostly, nothing at the scale of precision engineering, but enough to know what it felt like when a material responded to you correctly, when the resistance under your hands became something cooperative. She looked at him with the optical tools making her amber eyes enormous and said, "Responsive material handling is 70% intuition. Engineers who can't feel the resistance don't make good lattice work. You're saying I could do it. I'm saying the instinct for it doesn't come from training." She picked up one of her small tools and turned it in her fingers. "It either translates or it doesn't." She looked at him. "For what it's worth, the questions you've been asking for the last 20 minutes suggest it does." He didn't know what to do with that, so he asked another question about the outer ring compensation instead. Kale looked at the time display on her nearest tablet and then at him, and the expression under the optical tools was something he couldn't name yet. "You should sleep," she said. "You have an early shift." He did. He went back to his room. Through the wall faintly, he could hear the small sounds of her instruments, setting down and lifting up, and then settling into quiet. The second thing he was wrong about was Sarath. He had clocked her after the first week as someone who treated the apartment as a habitat and its occupants as background conditions, present, acknowledged, irrelevant to her primary concerns. She was never rude. She was never warm. She maintained the shared spaces with a scrupulous consistency that he appreciated, and that he was beginning to suspect was related to something deeper than tidiness. The way that some people's precision was an expression of care rather than simply an expression of control. He learned this on the 11th day, when he came home to find his port window had been repaired. He hadn't mentioned the port window. It had a slow seal leak that produced a faint draft from the station's outer pressurization system, not dangerous, just persistent, and he had been planning to put in a maintenance request that week. He came home, and the draft was gone, and there was a new polymer bead along the inner edge of the frame. He stood in his room for a moment. Then he went to the common area, where Sarath was sitting in one of the chairs with a data reader, and he said, "Did you fix my window seal?" She turned a page. The pressure variance was causing micro-variations in the apartment's thermal balance. It was more efficient to address it. He looked at her. "You fixed it because the temperature was off by a fraction of a degree. The sublevel 7 residential ring has thin exterior walls. The cumulative effect over a station cycle is not negligible." He thought about this. "Thank you," he said. She turned another page. It was a practical decision. It was still a kind one. She didn't answer that, but the set of her shoulders, barely perceptible, shifted not toward him, just a slight release of some tension that had been there, like a cable under load that had been given 1 degree of slack. He recognized it because he'd felt it too, more than once in this apartment, the particular easing of a thing you hadn't known you were bracing against. He went to make dinner and didn't press it. But he brought her tea without being asked, which was something he'd noticed she drank in the late afternoons, and set it on the small table beside her chair with no comment, and she picked it up without looking away from her reader, and neither of them said anything about it at all. The mineral specimens, he learned, were hers. She had been collecting them for 6 years, one from each transit hub she had passed through as a navigational systems consultant, which was her current occupation and the reason she was on Meridian Station at all. She had a 6-month contract here and had taken the apartment because short-term leases at this price didn't exist and the dormitory housing had no adequate space for specimens of this quantity. He found this out not through direct conversation, but through a process of gradual inference. A specimen on her desk visible through an open door, a specific gravity calculation running on her secondary screen when he passed, a brief exchange one morning when he picked up a rose-colored stone from the hall arrangement to look at it more closely. "Fell sight," she said, from 3 feet behind him, and he did not drop it only because he had reasonably good reflexes. "From the Kyrth Junction hub. It's from a sedimentary sequence that was excavated during the hub expansion 8 years ago." He turned. She was watching the stone in his hands, not him. "It's beautiful," he said. "It's unusual," she corrected, but gently. Felsite in that color range requires a very specific silica-iron interaction that's only stable under a narrow pressure window. Finding a piece this intact is uncommon. He held it carefully and looked at it the way he had looked at Kale's lattice, with full attention, and he felt her attention settle on him the way that objects settled into a gradient arrangement, finding the right place. "Can I ask about the others?" She told him about the others, all of them. For 2 hours on a rest day afternoon, she named every specimen and told him where it was from and what made it notable. And her voice, which he had heard as flat and precise, turned out to have a low, even warmth in it when she was talking about something that genuinely interested her. A warmth so contained and self-unaware that it was almost painful to notice. He had been there for 3 weeks when Kale appeared at his room door with a plate. It was not much of a plate. 2 wedge-cut pieces of something that smelled of roasted grain and a dark savory paste, arranged without ceremony. She held it out to him with the same directness she brought to every other operation. "You forgot to eat," she said. He blinked. "I know I was going to. You've been at that transit mapping problem for 4 hours. I saw the light under your door. It's past the 21st bell." She held the plate slightly further toward him, which was not a gesture of entreaty so much as a statement of logistics. "Eat the food." He ate the food. He sat in his doorway and she stood outside it, and he said, after the first bite, "This is really good. What is it?" "A grain paste we make in the Calvari system. The savory component is fermented seed stock. It's a standard working late food." She watched him eat it with the same evaluating attention she gave her resonance lattice. "The transit problem. Is it the routing grid for the sub-4 commercial ring?" He stared at her. "How did you know that?" "Because I've been here 6 months and the sub-4 commercial ring routing has been an inefficiency problem the entire time. I saw the grid schematics on your screen last week." She leaned on the doorframe with the ease of someone who had moved past the formality of asking. "You're trying to reduce the layover time at the junction nodes." "I'm not supposed to be working on it," he said. "It's not my problem. I run the routes. I'm not a systems engineer. I notice the pattern and then I can't stop thinking about the pattern." Kale looked at him with those amber eyes and their careful pupils and said, "I have a modeling tool that maps pressure lattice interference. The principles for routing node interference are structurally similar. Do you want to see it?" They worked until 1:30. She pulled up the modeling tool and he pulled up the routing data, and they talked in the way people talk when they have found a common frequency, interrupting, circling back, finishing sentences when the other person paused to think. She challenged his assumptions about the junction point 3 times and was right twice, and when she was wrong she said so with the same flatness she used when she was right, which he found deeply refreshing. At 1:30, he had a partial solution that was, genuinely, better than the one he'd been circling for 4 hours alone. "You should submit it," Kale said, when he sat back and looked at the model. It's not my job to submit routing improvements. Then whose job is it? He didn't have a good answer to that. Submit it, she said. If they ignore it, at least it's submitted. If they implement it, the sub-4 commercial ring will run better. She was already clearing her instruments from the space where she'd spread them to help him, stacking them with that characteristic brisk economy. The outcome is the same either way. You just don't do it. He looked at her profile in the dim light of his room, the copper-rose quality of her skin at the cheekbone, the careful way her hands sorted the instruments by size without seeming to look at them. You and Sarath, he said, how long have you been here together? 4 months, she didn't look up. We were assigned to adjacent rooms at the Callowell dormitory first. The sub-level dormitories are not well suited to our needs. What happened? We found the apartment. She paused. It was difficult to find. Multi-species shared housing at this level that is quiet and not performatively welcoming. He understood that. Performatively welcoming. The kind of housing that made a production of its multi-species composition, hung flags and printed inclusive signage, and thereby turned the entire space into an advertisement rather than a home. Did you ever find it hard, he said, before you found each other here? Cale was quiet for a moment, not the reserve that meant she was not going to answer, the quiet that meant she was deciding how accurately to answer. On Meridian Station, Sarath and I are 2 species that most humans haven't encountered in a domestic context. People are often curious in ways that are tiring. They ask questions about our biology. They invite us to events in order to have something to discuss with others. They are kind in ways that put us at the center without giving us any actual center to stand in. She finally looked up, and the amber eyes in the low light were something that Dex couldn't quite describe, not vulnerable, not soft, but with the particular quality of someone who has chosen to show you an accurate thing. You haven't done that, she said. You looked at my lattice like it was a lattice. You looked at Sarath's stones like they were stones. You didn't ask us what species we were for 3 days. I didn't want to seem. We know, she said. Sarath fixed your window. She gathered the last of her instruments. Go to sleep. He sat in his room after she left and looked at the routing model on his screen for a long time, not seeing it. The station ran on a 32-bell cycle, and the 29th through the 32nd bells were what everyone called the ghost shift. The hours when the commercial levels shut down, the transit lines went to minimum scheduling, and the sub-level residential ring got quiet in a way that felt, if you listened past the hum of the ventilation, almost like real quiet. On a ghost shift night 3 weeks after he'd moved in, Dex couldn't sleep. He was not in the habit of not sleeping, but he had submitted the routing improvement that morning and spent the rest of the day in a low-level state of anticipatory anxiety that he didn't want to examine too directly, because if he examined it, he would have to admit that he cared considerably more than was perhaps warranted about what 3 people sitting in a transit distribution office thought of a routing model he'd built with a materials engineer's borrowed software at 1 in the morning. He made tea. He was quiet about it because it was the 29th bell and the house rule was clear. He was standing at the kitchen alcove with his tea when he heard, from behind Sarath's door, a low sound he couldn't immediately identify. Not distress, not that, but a quality of sound that made him stop and pay attention with the particular alertness of someone who had learned, in a year of courier work, to calibrate sound against its context. He set his tea down. He stood in the common room between the mineral specimens on the low table and the 3 chairs and waited. The sound came again, then the door opened. Sarath stood in her doorway in sleep clothes, still the same controlled posture, but with a quality of careful neutrality that he was learning to read as something different from blankness. Her silver eyes moved to him, and then to the kitchen, and then back. I made tea, he said quietly. Do you want some? She was still for a moment that stretched past what was comfortable, and then became its own kind of communication. Then she walked to the kitchen, and he made her tea without asking what she wanted in it, because he had been in the apartment for 3 weeks and he had paid attention. She sat in one of the chairs with her hands around the cup, and he sat in another, and neither of them talked. This, he realized, was something Sarath was good at. Not the talking, the being in a space with another person without demanding that the space produce anything from it. He had lived with people who found silence threatening. Sarath found it the opposite, and sitting with her in it, he started to understand why she had fixed his window without saying it was kindness. Because she expressed care the way she arranged her specimens, through precision and attention and the quiet act of putting a thing right. After a while she said, without looking at him, "We received an offer today, Kale's contract extension, on Meridian." "That's good," he said. "It is." She turned the cup in her hands. The steam rose between them and disappeared. "She has been more settled here than I expected when we first found the apartment. Kale has strong preferences about her working environment, noise levels, ambient light during calibration. The kind of things that are difficult to negotiate in spaces that weren't designed with her work in mind." She paused. "This apartment is quiet. The kitchen alcove light has a consistent color temperature. The ventilation doesn't cycle in intervals that interfere with fine measurement work." She looked at her cup. "I don't think she'll turn down the extension." He waited. "I have 2 months left on my own contract. I had planned to transit to Velketh for the next placement." He waited. "I submitted an inquiry this morning to the Meridian Navigational Systems office about whether they have an available placement for the following cycle." She looked at him then. The silver eyes in the kitchen light were very still. "The accommodation here is suited to our requirements." He didn't answer immediately, and she didn't fill the silence, which was right, because what she had just said was not a small thing, and it deserved the weight of an actual moment. She had told him, in the precise and fact-naming way she told all things, that she was considering staying, that the apartment's thermal balance and the ventilation cycle and the light were reasons. He understood that they were not the only reasons, and that she would not say the other reasons directly because that was not how she said things. But she had said this, and she had said it at the 29th bell in the kitchen over tea, and it counted. "I'm glad," he said at last. She looked at him a moment longer, then she looked at her tea. "Kale thinks you'll submit the routing model to the wrong office and have to resubmit it." He felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't known was tense. "She's probably right. Which office should I go to?" "Sub-4 Commercial Transit Efficiency, not the general routing desk. The general desk will log it and do nothing." She said it with the tone of someone who had, at some point, submitted something to the wrong office and had a specific opinion about it. "How do you know the Sub-4 routing structure?" "I reviewed the navigational data sets when I arrived. It seemed useful." She paused. "I could tell you which junction nodes have the highest latency variance if you want to refine the model before you submit." He looked at her. "You've known about the routing problem since you got here." "I noticed it. It wasn't my problem to solve." She looked at him over the rim of her teacup, and the silver eyes had, just barely, the quality of something that in a different register would have been a smile. "It seems to have become yours." He submitted the model to Sub-4 Commercial Transit Efficiency at 800 the following morning. At 1300, while running a delivery route on the commercial level ring, he got a ping from an address he didn't recognize. He opened it while waiting for the lift. "Your routing model has been received by the Sub-4 Transit Efficiency team. We have reviewed the junction node modification proposal and forwarded it to the Senior Systems Coordinator for technical assessment. Initial review suggests the latency reduction estimate of approximately 14% is plausible and warrants a full modeling audit. We will be in contact. Meridian Station Transit Authority, Commercial Efficiency Division." Dex stood in the lift with his courier bag on his shoulder, and stared at this message for the entire ascent to sub 4 and part of the descent back. He sent Kale the message that evening. She read it, looked up at him from her project spread across the common table and said, 14% was a conservative estimate. I put it at 17. You ran the numbers independently. I was curious. She looked back at her lattice. You should ask for a consultation meeting with the senior coordinator. Don't wait for them to invite you. He hadn't thought of that. He set it up the next morning. The appointment was confirmed for the following 10-day. The 10-day came, and he came home from the consultation meeting at the 19th bell, and both Sarath and Kale were in the common room, which had not, in the 5 weeks he had lived there, happened in the evening hours, because their schedules ran in different enough patterns that the common room was usually occupied by one or none of them at this time of day. He stood in the doorway of the apartment for a moment, coat still on, and they both looked at him. Well, Kale said. They want to run a full pilot on the sub-4 ring, he said, with a formal credit to the modeling work. He paused. They asked if I wanted to work with their efficiency team on the implementation, as a consulting input. Silence. He became aware that his coat was still on and took it off. It's not a job offer, he said, which was true. It's not even close to that, it's a meeting. It's the first meeting, Sarath said from her chair, with the tone of someone correcting a mischaracterization. It's a significant first meeting, Kale said, with the tone of someone choosing to say the thing the other person in the room was, in her judgment, understating. He looked at them both, Sarath in her chair with the precise posture, and the silver eyes that had something warm in them that she was not performing, and Kale on the table with her lattice instruments, and the copper-rose quality of her, and the amber eyes that were watching him with that specific evaluating attention that he had come to understand, was not scrutiny, but investment. I want to show you both something, he said. He pulled out his data tablet and navigated to the routing model, the final version, the one they had built together at 1:30 on a weeknight, him asking questions and her pulling up tools and both of them talking in the way that people talk when they have found the right frequency. He had added Sarath's junction latency data the morning after the ghost shift T. The model had 17 nodes now instead of 11, and the latency reduction estimate had climbed from 14% to 16.8, and the senior coordinator had called it, in the meeting, the most coherent independent systems analysis we've received from a non-staff source in my tenure. He held the tablet so they could both see it. This has both of your data in it, he said. I put your names in the credit line. I told them a materials engineer and a navigational systems consultant contributed to the modeling. The coordinator asked who you were. Kale's pupils tracked to the screen and back. What did you say? I said you were colleagues. He paused. If that's I can change it, I should have asked first. But I didn't want to put your work in without crediting it, and the word I had that was accurate. It's accurate, Sarath said. She was looking at the screen. The silver eyes moved across the node layout, the junction markers, the percentage calculations, her own data, rendered in a model that had her name attached to it. He watched something shift in her expression that was not large but was not small either. The silver of her eyes seemed to carry something that he had not seen there before, or had seen and not recognized, the way you could look at a mineral specimen for a week without understanding what made it what it was until someone stood beside you and named it. It's accurate. It's accurate, Kale agreed. She was still looking at the screen, but one of her hands had reached out and straightened a copper conductor on the nearest instrument tray, a small, automatic gesture that had nothing to do with the conductor and everything to do with having somewhere for her hands to go. You should update the model to 16.8 for the formal submission. The 14% figure is outdated. I already did, he said. She looked at him. When? This morning, before the meeting. I also added a footnote attributing the junction latency breakdown to Sarath and the resonance interference modeling principle to you. Another silence. The common room held it, the mineral specimens on the low table, the lattice instruments in their careful array, the 3 chairs that he had come to think of as each belonging to someone, though they had never assigned them and he had never asked. "You put us in the footnote," Cale said, not as a question. "You were there," he said. "You should be in the footnote." Sareth was quiet for a moment that had the quality of all her significant pauses, the ones that were not absence but a kind of careful accounting. Then she said, "The Vel-Keth placement inquiry came back. They have an opening for the cycle after next." He looked at her. "I submitted the Meridian inquiry this morning as well," she said. "I have not made a decision." He understood that she was telling him something, and that she was telling him in the only register she had, the one that named facts precisely, and let the weight of them stand without additional instruction. "I think," he said carefully, "that you should do whichever placement is right for your work," and he stopped, started again. "I would like it if the placement that was right for your work happened to be here." Sareth looked at him. The silver eyes were very still in the way that, he had learned, meant she was processing something that required full attention rather than the kind of thinking that could happen while she was looking at other things. "I'll review the Meridian placement scope," she said. "It may be adequate." Cale set down the copper conductor she had been re-straightening and made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. He looked at her and she looked back at him with the amber eyes and the faint glow at her cheekbones, and whatever the sound had been, it was warm. He had lived in the apartment for 2 months when he came home to find Cale's lattice displayed in the center of the common table in the gap between the mineral specimens, propped at a slight angle to catch the apartment's overhead light, and the light it threw back was not the light of the testing process but something slower and more deliberate, the refracted colors of a finished piece. He stood in the doorway with his courier bag and looked at it. She came out of her room. She stood beside the table and looked at the lattice, and then at him, and her expression was the evaluating one she wore most of the time. But there was something underneath it, not softness exactly, but the quality that surfaces in someone who has spent a long time keeping a completed thing to themselves and has decided, for the first time, to set it where the light can find it. "It's finished," she said. "It's beautiful," he said. "I know." The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. The interference correction worked. The outer ring held at 0.01 variance. It's better than the specification. "What happens to it now?" She was quiet for a moment. "It's a proof of concept piece. It goes into the research record." She looked at it. "After that, I can do what I like with it." He crossed to the table and looked at it properly. The geometry of the lattice, the faint copper lines that ran through the matrix at angles that were both precise and somehow organic, the way the whole thing held light from different directions without choosing a single one. 6 months of work, interrupted at 200 on a dozen nights by a courier who didn't know what he was looking at and asked anyway. "Can I?" He gestured, not to touch it but indicating the question. "Yes," she said. He picked it up with the care he'd have given Sareth's felsite. It was lighter than he expected, and warmer against his palms, not temperature but quality, the way a thing felt that had been made by someone who understood it. The facets moved as he turned it, and the light moved with them. "Cale," he said. "Yes. I think this is the best thing I've held in my hands since I got to this station." The copper-rose glow at her cheekbones brightened by a fraction that was just visible and then was still. She looked at the lattice in his hands rather than at him. "That's a low bar," she said. "You handle cargo all day." "The cargo doesn't count." She was quiet. The lattice threw its refracted light across the mineral specimens. "You can keep it," she said, "if you want to. The research record takes a scan, not the piece itself." He looked up. She was looking at the lattice, not him, which he understood was her equivalent of what another person might have done with their eyes, a kind of looking away in order to say something accurately. "I'll take care of it," he said. "I know," she said. Sarath's door opened. She came out into the common room, saw the lattice in his hands, looked at the way he was holding it, and crossed to the low table to adjust one of the mineral specimens by a degree or two. "The meridian placement review confirmed adequate scope," she said, to the middle distance, the way she often said things that were addressed to the room at general. "I submitted an acceptance this morning." He looked at her. She looked at the specimen she had just adjusted. "Sub-7 Callowell has good exterior wall pressure consistency for the next 8 months, she said, according to the station maintenance forecast. He held Cale's lattice in both hands and looked at Sarath's back as she studied her specimens, and felt something settle in his chest that was not one thing but several things together. The particular warmth of being in a room with people who had decided, without theater and without declaration, that you were part of the arrangement. "I'll put the kettle on," he said. Neither of them told him not to. The routing pilot launched on the Sub-4 commercial ring on the first day of the next station cycle, and the initial latency measurements came back 3 days later with a 16.3% improvement, which was close enough to 16.8 that the senior coordinator called it a success, and Cale said, in the tone she used for all factual assessments, that the 0.5 discrepancy was within the expected real-world variance, and the model was sound. The transit authority sent Dex a follow-up message asking whether he would be available for a consultation engagement on the Sub-7 residential ring routing network, which had, as it turned out, comparable efficiency problems and now had a name attached to methodology that might address them. He said yes. He carbon-copied the message to Cale and Sarath. Cale sent back a one-line response, "I'll update the modeling tool." Sarath sent back a navigational data set for the Sub-7 ring with a note that said, "Junction nodes 4 through 9 have the highest variance. Start there." He saved both messages in the same folder as the routing model and the first transit authority confirmation. He labeled the folder with the apartment number and left it at that, because some things didn't require more explanation than where they had happened and who had been in the room. The mineral specimens on the low table caught the morning light from the kitchen alcove and threw it, amber and rose and pale violet, across the walls. The lattice on his shelf threw a different light, copper-threaded, geometric, moving when the ventilation shifted the air in his room. Outside his port window, sealed tight and draft-free, Sub-7's inner ring went about its day. The apartment was not large. It was not particularly quiet, in the way that Sarath had quiet and Cale had her own loud version of quiet at 2 in the morning. It was not what he had expected when he answered the listing, and it was, without question, the best room he had ever found. He made 3 cups of tea, the way he had learned each of them took it, Sarath's plain and very hot, Cale's with the ground seed additive she kept in a small amber jar on the second shelf, his own the way he'd always made it, which was not particularly considered but had the advantage of consistency. He set them on the low table, beside the minerals, and beside the space where Cale's lattice had been before he put it on his shelf. Sarath came and sat in her chair. Cale came and sat on the table, which she had been doing since the first week and had never stopped, because the chairs were for sitting, and the table was apparently also for sitting if you were Cale and had decided this was the case. The apartment held its own particular quiet, ventilation hum and the distant station sounds of Sub-7 going about its business, and the small sounds of 2 people he had known for 2 months and who had become, without any formal declaration or event, the shape of his evenings. The mineral specimens caught the overhead light. The lattice on his shelf was doing something complicated with the same light, throwing it in copper threads across the ceiling that neither of them mentioned, because it was just a thing that happened in this room now. The Sub-7 routing engagement, Kale said, after a while, looking at her tea. When they schedule the first consultation meeting, you should bring the sublevel pressure mapping I ran for the lattice project. The variance models are compatible. I was already planning to ask you for it, he said. She looked up. I know, she said. I was going to offer before you asked. Sarath turned a page on her reader. I'll have the navigational baseline data compiled by the end of the week, she said, to no one specifically. The Sub-7 residential ring has a different junction architecture than Sub-4. You'll need to recalibrate the node weighting. I'll wait for your data before I touch the weighting, he said. She turned another page. The copper light from the lattice moved across the ceiling as the ventilation shifted. He made 3 cups of tea. The 20-second bell was a long way off. There was time.